Hello and welcome back to Radio 2. Today we're on lecture 7, so we're starting something new today, something exciting and one of my favorite parts of radio. So what we're going to be looking at today is the introduction to the broadcasting chain and just to this technology on the whole. I want you to take your books and turn to page 263 at the bottom there, where it says example 7A, an outside broadcast. Okay, so I'm not going to read the section to you now, but I do want you to read this 1, 2, 3 pages before we start with the class. Okay, so it's really important that you start with it. So it's so the heading there is connecting the nation to the 2016 Metro FM Music Awards in the host city of Durban. I want you to take your textbook and go to page 251. So there at the top, it says activity 7A. Number 1, a radio station has its permanent on-air studio in Cape Town, but wants to broadcast from the Mangaung African Culture Festival, a music festival that takes place just outside of Bloemfontein. Create a graphic representation of the input and output links that this permanent on-air studio will need in order to achieve this technically. So that's something you need to keep in mind, as this is something you'll answer. In your own words, define and explain the differences between the following types of broadcast studios: permanent on-air studio, a remote studio, and an outside broadcast studio. Then number 3 there, imagine that you are the program manager of an urban youth radio station in Johannesburg, and your breakfast show wants to broadcast from Los Angeles for the Black Entertainment Television Awards. Explain the technical support that you would need in order to broadcast from another country, as well as the technical chain involved in making that broadcast a reality. So I want you to take a second or two, think about this, okay? So all 3 of these. So the input and output links that you would need from your permanent on-air studio to be able to broadcast from Mangaung. Then the differences in the 3 types of studios. And then lastly, if you want to broadcast from overseas, from LA, what would you need? And the technical chain then involved. So this is in a nutshell, basically what we'll be covering today is all of this. If we start at the beginning, for there to be listeners, there must be the ability to hear things. If I can't hear it, I won't listen. Although this sounds quite logical, in order to have radio at all, to produce exciting programs and build audiences that advertisers can reach, it is essential to have a solid technical foundation supported by working equipment and computer programs that set the standard for a quality radio broadcast. Okay, so when you go into radio stations, the equipment there isn't secondhand equipment, it isn't broken equipment. If it's a radio station that's worth listening to, that has really good presenters, the equipment will be good as well. Because without you need the equipment to assist you in making good programming. The listener is 100% dependent on the sound in the immediate radio environment, whether they are listening online or through an old-fashioned set in their car. It doesn't really matter, or in their kitchen or in their bedroom. It doesn't matter where they're listening. But the listener is dependent on you and your sound when they listen. Okay, so there are 2 sides to radio technology, as you will see as we move along. The first side is the equipment or the hardware itself, and our radio through radio waves and audio through the internet reaches the listeners from a scientific and mechanical standpoint. So how through all this hardware and equipment does the sound travel through it and reach the person at the other side? The second side is how the radio professionals, and this when I say radio professionals, this means producers, desk drivers, the DJs, the presenters, whoever, utilize modern software and computer programs in conjunction with the studio to utilize broadcast equipment to enhance their radio program delivery and enrich their shows.
So how do they use everything there, the software and the computer programs, to make the best show they possibly can? Before the listeners hear and engages with an audio product, there are a number of systems and processes that need to be aligned to be able to deliver a broadcast.
For instance, if you go into a radio station, even if you're going to the BMH radio station, there's hardware in there that will enable you to broadcast, obviously. So your microphone, computer, the desk, the mixer. But on the other side, there's also a variety of software programs available, specifically designed for radio broadcast that allows for the execution of content on several channels so that delivery would be seamless on air.
The integration of this hardware and software interface connects both inside the studio and across the broadcast footprint of any radio station through communication towers. We're going to get into that a little bit later. This integration also allows for station management to control and monitor the output of each minute of programming so that it drives the overall station strategy and continues to attract and retain our listeners. So when we're done with this chapter, when we are done at the end of the 6 lessons, you should be able to outline the broadcasting chain for me, explain the basics of playout systems, newsroom software and technologies, audio production systems, social media systems, discuss the studio acoustics in the line of sight, explain the basics of microphones, headphones, and monitor speakers, demonstrate an understanding of how the mixing desk functions in terms of faders, pre-fade listen, levels, processing, gains, equalizers, and pan controls. If you were in the class where Michael spoke, you would have heard a lot of these terms. Seeing as a producer, he uses a lot of this. Then you should be able to describe all the equipment needed for an OB and the options available for open broadcaster software with reference to broadband data and radio signals. You should know the different types of OBs that you get, so how you can make them with all these software. Identify and elaborate on transmission distribution technology and explain studio fault logs, what they are, house style guides, and procedures associated with maintenance and studio security, important.
Think about times that you've listened to the radio station where it started crackling, where it completely went off air. So there can be 2 scenarios there that might happen. Or the sound is just not completely clear. It just sounds like they're talking in a bathroom or a tin can. So these are all things that have to do with radio technology. If we start by looking at the broadcasting chain, what is that? What is this broadcasting chain that I'm speaking of? The broadcasting chain refers to a series of connections between the systems where content is loaded, the transmission point of that content, and the signal distribution point that come in and out of the broadcast studio. So it's about a couple of connections between the systems where the content is currently loaded on, the transmission point of that content, and the signal distribution points. Okay, all of this is between the studio, so in and out of the broadcast studio. Okay, I'm going to be jumping around a little bit here. This graph is in your textbook on page 250. And what this shows is, it shows the input links, which bring content into the studio. In this case, this would be referred to as a permanent on-air studio. Then on this side, the output links transmit the studio's produced content out to the listening audience. So here, input in, radio broadcast studio, output out, via a number of different ways and platforms. Okay, so if we look at the input links, which bring the content into the broadcast studio, so on the side, telephone lines, obviously a big one. So if we look at this, how do you bring the content into the broadcast studio? So via telephone lines, via the internet, via integrated service digital network or IDSN lines, or asymmetrical digital subscriber lines, ADSL lines. Both of those are used for OBs. OBs meaning outside broadcasts. If we then look at the output links, which then transmit the content out to the listening audience. So from this side, again, telephone lines. So traditional telephone lines, again, internet lines. So if you think about streaming, satellite links, if you listen to satellite radio, or normal FM signals that are caught and routed by an FM transmitter. So there's a number of different ways that people can listen to radio, obviously, but it all starts at the beginning. So an input that goes in and then an output that goes out. Just another example, this one is a little bit more in depth. We'll get into this in the next lessons. This is a simplified diagram of a traditional radio studio. So here you can see we've got the mics, we've got the telephone, we've got the, this is very old, the tape player, and then we've got the computer, which is all connected to the mixer on the one side, which goes out via analog signals or digital signals. Analog would be, for example, FM, digital, for example, streaming. So if we think about a permanent studio versus a remote studio. So a permanent studio is, for instance, the BMH radio's studio. That is a permanent studio. This is where most of your broadcasting is done. And this studio specifically is constantly in use. A remote studio, on the other hand, is a studio that will connect to the permanent on-air studio in order for it to go live or on air. So a remote studio is the main site for all live broadcast activity when it's required. But also having access to a remote studio helps radio stations to manage the delivery of a radio show regardless of where on-air presenters might be. A very good example of this is the SABC. So they have their permanent studios in the Auckland Park building, but then in both Durban and Cape Town, let's say for instance, 5FM has a remote studio from where a presenter can broadcast if the need arises. Another example of this would be if a DJ has a gig, let's say in Cape Town, and they have their show that they are supposed to be doing. If they're from Johannesburg, then they can go into the SABC studios in Sea Point in Cape Town and use the remote studio there to broadcast from. The same way if a presenter needs to travel overseas to attend an important event, they can go to a remote studio there and go live in the same time as the show would be here in South Africa. So times have changed a lot, and it's become a lot easier for a presenter to broadcast from anywhere. On the other hand to that, so that was now permanent studios and remote studios. Then you have your outside broadcasts or the outside broadcast studios. They are a lot less like a physical studio space and more like pop-up mobile studios. So in essence, there's just a collection of studio equipment that can be utilized to create a mobile unit. Sometimes you get OB vans, so the whole setup is already in the van and they can purely travel with the van, while others would simply consist of a table and chair set up with a microphone, a mixer, and a codec. And a codec is a device that encodes a signal for broadcast. The codec then connects the whole setup with the permanent studio, which will then obviously send the content out to the transmitter network of the audience, and you'll hear it wherever you are listening from. We'll look at this a little bit later on again in the chapter. Or you'd normally have a producer in studio, and then obviously the rest of the team would be at the outside broadcast. So while we are looking at OBs and OB studios, currently we're sitting in COVID, and there's a lot of presenters who are not broadcasting from their permanent studios as they normally would. They're also not necessarily broadcasting from a remote studio. A lot of them are doing it from home, so as a team or wherever they are at the moment. So I decided to get you some examples of what it looks like if you need to do your show, but you aren't anywhere where there is a remote studio or your permanent studio. So in this case, so here you can see the 5 Drive team, or rather Nick Hammond in this one, from the afternoon drive show on 5FM. This was during their heritage tour last year. Their setup is very simple and plain and straightforward. So he's got his microphone and headphones 2-in-1 there. And then here they have something that is called the Rodecaster Pro. So it has the ability to work off a power bank. So they can be literally anywhere with a good 4G signal. So this is a very simple, straightforward setup, as you can see. So here's the 5Drive team on location again. And you can see this is literally all it takes them to do their show from, to do their outside broadcast from. There's this video I found on social media, which I just want to show you to give you a clearer idea of what it looks like. Okay. Okay, so you can see literally their setup. So there's the microphone. Nadia's prepping her news, I assume. Microphone. There's playout or their codec system that they need. And laptops. And the cables and everything is plugged in, and that's it. You're ready to go. Okay, so you should have a very clear understanding now of the difference between the three. Okay, so you have a permanent studio, you have a remote studio, and then you have a studio setup with the outside broadcasts. So if you are into podcasting, you would use something similar to what I just showed you. That's the kind of setup that works for podcasting also.
We move on to the newsroom. For many radio stations, the newsroom is the most active and busy of their spaces. It represents a continuous process of obtaining, writing, recording, and dispatching information as quickly and as interestingly and as accurately as possible. The types of news coverage of a radio station can range from public to official news to professional, proactive generation of news to commercial-based news and entertainment. So there are quite a few different types of news that it can be. If we look at the breakdown of the different types of news, public news is received through listeners who believe that their local radio station should know about the various community events that they're holding, or who are parts of various societies or organizations. Official news then comes predominantly from government sources, such as the police, fire and medical services, public transport authorities, and various service organizations that are managed partially or completely through the government.
Professional news involves the station's own reporters and correspondents who cover various beats or work as freelance stringers for the newsroom. They cover politics, crime, and other types of news using their established connection base. This type of news also includes various news agencies or news wires. Commercial news, on the other hand, is news that is derived from businesses and public relations services and departments. This includes entertainment content. It's the newsroom's job to receive, sort, file, draft, and create concise, compelling news bulletins out of all this information. So the newsroom plays a vital role in ensuring the accuracy and reliability of the information that it receives. So unfortunately, what can happen is it can become tempting for a newsroom to rely on timely, well-worded press releases that are submitted by corporations or individuals coming forward with seemingly helpful and sometimes juicy pieces of information. However, there's a moral obligation of the radio newsroom to establish factuality in that information, regardless of bulletin deadlines that may be looming or constant pressure for break news. So in today's time, a lot of the news that reaches a radio newsroom is gathered from online sources. And although this can be the base of a good story, A newsroom professional would always look for alternative sources of information in order just to secure a better accuracy and to add to a story's relevance for the station's listeners. The other side of the newsroom would always be prepared for breaking news. At all times, the newsroom has a station's listenership, so it will always make sure that it has the most relevant and interesting stories that they're putting forth for the listeners. So when we look at the structure of newsrooms, every newsroom will look a little bit different, just like every radio station will have a little bit of a different setup. In terms of similarities, however, all newsrooms have 3 distinct sections. So all of them have the reporter's desk, the bulletin desk, and the reader's booth. When we look at the reporter's desk, at some radio stations, the reporter's desk is labeled as the input section. This is where original news is sourced and written. So journalists would typically have their own workstation in the open plan office, while an editor on the reporter's desk is often placed among the journalists in this open plan office. This would obviously allow for ease of communication. So all the members of the reporter's desk will have access to the same news production software. And most newsrooms will give their journalists laptops, as it's portable, but it must also have a large enough keyboard for them to rapidly type their news copy. Increasingly currently, we're finding that radio reporters are using their smartphones for news production purposes. This means that they need to have special hardware on their phones for this, like for instance, iRig for iPhones or an Android version of it also. If we look at news production software in the reporter's desk, NewsBoss is a news production software suite that is favored by a few radio stations, while other offerings include ENPS and Newsroom. All of these have a few basic features in common. However, the most important is that they're stable and that they won't easily break down. Imagine having your software crash just before you're going on air. No one wants that to happen to them. Some news production software suites allow for the automatic saving of work in case of power cuts. So at the end of the day, the same basic software just needs to be available in all the newsroom journalists. The same basic software just needs to be available to all newsroom journalists, whether they're copywriters, reporters, or editors. With regards to social media, these days, radio journalists also produce news stories on Twitter, Facebook, and other social media platforms. These platforms are also considered broadcast facilities because they reach many listeners or users in a short space of time and deliver rapid coverage. So here the reporter will file copy for radio using dedicated news production software and will then copy and paste elements of the news text to the radio station's designated social media feeds. As you can imagine, this is not the most effective method of radio and social media news production, and we're already seeing greater integration of social media news production into features currently available on radio news production platforms. If we look at the regulatory requirements, newsroom management requires that radio stations report to the authorities regarding the content of their news. Some news software programs allow for categorization of news items. Every radio journalist is expected to add sound bites to their news copy. Noise cancelling software is often essential as newsrooms are noisy places. Many newsrooms have relationships with counterparts in other countries or other parts of the country where an exchange of stories can take place. Some larger newsrooms have dedicated sound monitoring sections where journalists monitor partner services and stations like BBC or CNN. Alongside the reporter section of the newsroom lies the bulletin section. This is sometimes referred to as the news output section, so input section and output section. And this is where the copy editors and newsreaders are located. Copy editors and newsreaders work closely together. The copy editor's role is to use the software to, once again, check the copy that has been filed by the radio reporter and examined earlier by the editor. Newsroom production software includes a system that tracks who has checked and contributed to copy. This is important in ensuring accountability for errors, as well as for acknowledging good performance. Some larger newsrooms gives this final checking desk special prominence, and perhaps even give them a special title, like the chair or the super desk. The final section of the newsroom is the reader's booth, where the presenter can then interact with the newsreader. However, in many cases, the newsreader will read from a soundproof booth and will read off the screen from the same software used by the reporters to generate the news. Often the newsreader may not have the rights to change the copy that has been cleared for the broadcast. All software allows for printing of bulletins as a backup in case of a dreaded power failure, which can happen, or a computer crash, or for backup purposes in studio.
Okay, so that was quite a large amount of information to take in today. And I do realize it's not necessarily the most exciting sides of radio, but it's a foundation that we're busy laying, which you need to know. And the next class, I promise you, is going to be really exciting, because it's going to be about all the different playback systems. And well, it's really exciting for me. So just taking a look at everything that we should have taken in from today. So there are two sides to radio technology. The one side is the equipment, as well as how radio reaches the listener from a mechanical and a scientific point. And then the other side is how radio professionals use the software, modern software, and computer programs in conjunction with the studio to make the best possible radio that they can. The broadcasting chain, what is this? It refers to a series of connections between the systems where content is loaded, the transmission point of that content, and the signal distribution points that come in and out of the broadcast studio. So everything to do with the mixer and the studio, everything that goes in and everything that goes out, okay? Things that can come in, telephone lines, internet, IDSN, ADSL. Things that can go out, telephone lines, internet lines for streaming, satellite links, and FM signals. A permanent studio and a remote studio. A permanent studio is the main studio, the one where most of the broadcasting is done. A remote studio is an extra studio that gets used. The remote studio is a studio that gets used when you can't access the permanent studio. So if you're traveling, let's say to Cape Town for work and your main studio is in Johannesburg, then there's a studio where you can go broadcast from. And then obviously an outside broadcast is something that's just placed there for a few hours, for the amount of hours that you're doing the broadcast outside of the studio. This can be either a big broadcast with a lot of elements included, or it can be a small broadcast with only the bare minimum that's needed to be able to broadcast. And then in terms of news, public news is received through listeners who believe that their local stations should know about various community events. Official news comes predominantly from government sources. Professional news involves the radio station's own reporters and correspondents. Commercial news is news that is derived from businesses and public relations services and departments. The news structure of most radio stations have three distinctions, namely the reporter's desk, the bulletin desk, and the reader's booth. The reporter's desk is also labeled as the input section, whereas the bulletin desk is sometimes referred to as the news output section. The reader's booth, on the other hand, is a soundproofed booth where the newsreader will go sit to read the news from if needed. There are a couple of regulatory requirements that that needs to be adhered to here. Newsroom management requires that radio stations report to the authorities regarding the content of their news. Every journalist is expected to add sound bites to their news copy. Noise cancelling software is often essential, as newsrooms are noisy places. And then some larger newsrooms have dedicated sound monitoring sections where journalists monitor partner services and stations like BBC or CNN. Okay, and with that, I'm going to say goodbye until our next lesson. So have a good afternoon and remember to listen to radio.